There are rooms in this world that don't exist on any map. No photographs. No guest lists published anywhere. No press releases sent out the morning after. Just a private address, a carefully chosen group of people, and an unspoken agreement that whatever happens inside those walls stays there. This is a story about one of those rooms, and about the night that agreement was shattered. It was the last week of February, 2026. Los Angeles. One of those elevated neighborhoods that sit above the city like a quiet declaration of power. The kind of address that communicates everything about who you are without needing to say a single word. The host's identity has been carefully protected by every source who has spoken about this evening. What we do know is this. They occupied a rare intersection of entertainment, technology, and the kind of philanthropic influence that only serious money buys in American cultural life. The kind of host whose invitation list is the message. To be on it means you matter. To be left off it means you don't. And on that February evening, Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex, was on it. What happened next, nobody in that room saw coming. Not the media executives. Not the technology figures. Not the people with quiet, powerful connections stretching from Los Angeles all the way to London. By the time the evening ended, phones were buzzing. Calls were being made in hushed corners. And somewhere across the Atlantic, in the early hours of the morning, people were waking up to news they had never expected to receive. To understand what Meghan did that night, you first need to understand who she walked into that room to face. Here is what most people get wrong when they imagine Meghan's social world in California. They picture Hollywood, glamour, admirers, people who are simply thrilled to be near her, who hang on every word and validate every choice. That is not the room she walked into that February evening. The people assembled in that private Los Angeles residence were figures of genuine, independent power. Media executives who decide which stories get told and which ones get buried. Technology figures whose platforms have redefined what influence even means. Philanthropic leaders whose endorsement can make or break a public identity overnight. These were people who didn't need Meghan. And that single detail is what made the room so dangerous. Because when you walk into a space full of people who don't need you, you cannot coast on charm alone. You cannot rely on a famous name. You cannot perform your way through an evening and expect nobody to notice the gap between the performance and the person underneath it. These were evaluators, sophisticated ones, people who had spent their entire careers measuring the distance between what someone says they are and what they actually are. Sources who were present described those first minutes with a striking consistency. She was composed, warm in the practiced, precise way of someone who has performed warmth in high-stakes rooms for years. She moved through the initial greetings with the ease of someone who understood exactly what kind of attention was being extended to her and had prepared herself to meet it. But preparation and ease are not the same thing. In a room full of people sophisticated enough to know the difference, that distinction was quietly, carefully noted. For the first hour, Meghan held her ground. She was articulate, engaged, and demonstrated the intellectual fluency that has always been among her most genuine assets. Questions were answered fluently, warmly, and with the kind of detail that suggested she had not simply rehearsed her narrative, but had genuinely lived inside it. And then something shifted. Not in the room's behavior toward Meghan. In Meghan's behavior toward the room. Every person in that room noticed it. It didn't matter where they were standing. It didn't matter how they felt about Meghan personally, or what they thought of the choices she had made in the years since leaving royal life. Every single source who was present at the February gathering describes the same moment, independently, without apparent coordination, using strikingly similar language. She stopped performing. It began simply enough. A guest had raised a question, approximately 20 minutes earlier, about the direction of the Sussex Foundation. Phrased with the precision that sophisticated people use when they want an honest answer, but are prepared for a rehearsed one. Meghan had answered it the first time with the fluency the room had come to expect from her. But she hadn't finished with it. When she set down her glass, and sources note that detail specifically the deliberate setting down of the glass, the small gesture of someone who has made a decision, and turned toward the wider group, the register of her voice had changed. Less careful, less controlled, more direct than anyone in that room had ever heard from her in any context, public or private. One source described it as watching someone remove a mask they had been wearing for so long that the act of removal felt almost violent in its abruptness. She said the version of her story the public had been given was incomplete. Not a lie, She was careful about that distinction, careful in a way that felt personal rather than strategic, but incomplete in ways she had decided some time ago. She was no longer willing to maintain in rooms where that incompleteness served nobody and cost her far more than the protection it offered. The room went very quiet. What followed was approximately 12 minutes of disclosure that sources describe as genuinely extraordinary. Meghan spoke about the period immediately preceding her and Harry's decision to step back from royal duties. Not the public version, the one documented in interviews, the Netflix series, the memoir. The private version. The version that existed in the gap between what had been said publicly and what had actually been experienced privately. She described a level of institutional isolation that went considerably beyond anything the couple had ever conveyed publicly. Decisions made about their security, their funding, their public role, and their private access to family support, characterized not as the product of misunderstanding or poor communication, but as deliberate, coordinated, and originating from a specific point of institutional authority whose identity she did not name, but whose description left very little room for ambiguity. And then she said the thing that nobody expected. The thing that changed the temperature of the entire room. She named a specific decision. One decision, made at a specific moment, by a specific institutional process, that she said was the point at which she understood, with complete clarity, that the situation she was in was not one that goodwill, patience, or private negotiation was ever going to resolve. She did not qualify it. She did not soften it with the careful diplomatic language that has characterized every previous public statement she has ever made about her time inside the royal family. She said it plainly, directly, and with the particular finality of someone who has made a decision about what they are no longer willing to carry alone. Understand something fundamental about the specific social world assembled in that Los Angeles residence that evening. These were not people who lost their composure easily. They were not people who had arrived at their respective positions in American cultural, commercial, and technological life by being easily rattled or publicly expressive about their private reactions to unexpected information. They were, by professional training and personal instinct, people who had learned to process surprising things without letting the surprise show, until they had decided what showing it would cost them. The management of reaction is itself a form of power in rooms like that one, which is precisely why the immediate response to what Meghan had just said was so telling, because it broke that discipline. Not universally, not completely, but enough. People who were paid in one form or another to never look surprised ended up looking surprised. The room divided, not along lines a casual observer would have predicted, not into a simple opposition between supporters and skeptics. It divided along something more nuanced. What each person in that room stood to gain or lose from the information they had just been given, and how that calculation interacted with their existing relationship to the story Meghan had been telling publicly for years. A cluster of guests from the media and publishing world moved immediately into what sources describe as professional assessment mode. Not hostile, not sympathetic, analytical. These were people whose entire professional existence was built around the evaluation of narrative. And what they had just witnessed was, in their instinctive assessment, a narrative event of considerable significance. A second group, smaller and positioned closer to Meghan within the room's social geography, responded with what sources describe as genuine personal discomfort. Not because they disbelieved what she had said, because they believed it and immediately understood what the consequences of saying it in that room, among those people, without the protective framework of a formal media interview or a published memoir, would be. One guest was observed leaving the main reception room within 4 minutes of Meghan finishing speaking. They did not return for 20 minutes. When they did, their expression had the particular quality of someone who has just had a telephone conversation that confirmed their worst instincts about a situation they were standing in the middle of. The calls started before the cars arrived. That is the detail that sources consistently emphasize. Not the following morning. Not in the careful, considered communications that might characterize the aftermath of a genuinely private event. Before the gathering had formally concluded, before Meghan herself had left, messages were being composed and sent. Calls were being made in private corners of the residence, and in the quiet of vehicles summoned with an urgency the evening had not, when it began, seemed likely to generate. Entertainment figures calling media contacts. Technology figures reaching transatlantic connections. And at least 2 calls, sources confirm, were placed directly to individuals with documented connections to the British establishment, whose interest in anything Meghan said about her time inside the royal family was not casual or personal, but deeply, specifically institutional. Those calls reached London before midnight Pacific time. The people who received them did not go back to sleep. The call that mattered most arrived at a private number inside the British establishment at 4:47 in the morning of March 1st, 2026. Not a palace switchboard. Not a press office line that would have routed the information through the ordinary channels of royal communications management. A private number, the kind that only exists in the contacts of people whose connection to the institution is personal enough and serious enough that the ordinary architecture of royal communications has never been their primary channel. The person who received it listened for 6 minutes without speaking, asked 2 questions, received 2 answers, and then sat with what they had just been told for long enough that the window in the room had begun to lighten before they moved again. By 8 in the morning, London time, 3 senior figures with direct connections to the palace's communications and legal structure were aware of the broad shape of what had happened at the Los Angeles gathering. Not the precise words, not the specific detail of the decision Meghan had named so plainly in front of a room full of the most connected people in American cultural life, but the fact of the disclosure. The fact that Meghan had stepped outside every framework of careful narrative management she had previously operated within, and the fact that the palace was going to have to think very carefully about what came next. The response they settled on was the same one the palace has deployed with increasing frequency in every significant crisis over the preceding 12 months. Silence. Deliberate, considered institutional silence that communicates neither confirmation nor denial and gives nothing to the media ecosystem that was, by the time London woke fully that morning, already beginning to sense that something significant had occurred. Harry learned what Meghan had said not from Meghan. He learned it from a member of their own inner circle who had heard from someone present at the gathering and understood correctly that Harry needed to know before the information reached him through any less controlled channel. Sources describe Harry's demeanor in the hours that followed with careful verbal precision, the particular precision of people choosing their words around something genuinely sensitive. He was not angry in any visible or externally expressed sense. He was, according to one source with direct knowledge, very quiet. The kind of quiet that those who know him well recognize as the internal processing of something that has landed with a weight he had not prepared himself to absorb. The question that the palace, Harry, and everyone who witnessed that February evening is still sitting with is the same question. Was it deliberate? Was this a calculated decision? A woman who has spent years managing her narrative with extraordinary precision choosing, in that specific room among those specific people, to finally say what she had always needed to say. Or was it something else entirely? A crack in the armor, a moment of genuine human exhaustion from carrying a story that had grown too heavy to carry alone? Everything Meghan has built since leaving the royal family, the commercial ventures, the advocacy platform, the carefully constructed public identity of a woman living purposefully and authentically on her own terms. All of it depended on her ability to control her own narrative with a precision that matched or exceeded the palace's own considerable capacity for narrative management. The moment that control slips, the moment the gap between the managed version and the private reality becomes visible to the specific audience whose belief in the managed version is commercially and culturally essential, everything built on that foundation becomes vulnerable simultaneously. The February gathering was that moment. Not because what Meghan said was untrue. Sources who were present are consistent in their assessment that what she disclosed carried the quality of genuine conviction rather than strategic fabrication. But because she said it in a room she could not fully control, to an audience she could not fully trust, without any of the protective frameworks that had allowed her team to manage every previous disclosure. For the royal family watching from across the Atlantic, the February gathering represents something almost satisfying in its institutional clarity. A story dismantling itself does not require engagement. For Harry, the implications are more personal and more painful than any institutional calculus can capture. And for Meghan herself, the question remains open. Was the February gathering a moment of genuine liberation, finally saying what she had always needed to say? Or was it the night she looks back on as the moment the carefully constructed architecture of her California reinvention developed a crack that nothing she builds subsequently will fully repair? The people who were in that room believe they already know which way it is leaning.